Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Current Affairs Unfiltered. I'm your host, Paige Fullman. This week, we are sitting down with Conor Lamb. Conor Lamb is a former U.S. representative that represented Pennsylvania's 18th District, Marine officer, and member of the Pennsylvania Association for Justice. Most recently, he also ran against John Fetterman in the 2022 United States Senate Democratic primary election. Conor is obviously a very accomplished Democrat and won in a very, very tough district for Democrats in 2018. So I thought it would be great to have him on to discuss literally everything from his career to some of his recent Substack pieces about accountability and voting rights to speaking about more of the Democratic Party on the whole. Are we moving in the right direction? Plus, I also couldn't help myself. I had to ask about John Fetterman because we all know what a mess that has turned out to be, in my humble opinion. I think Conor has some great takes. I think he has such a wide breadth of knowledge and of experiences that not a lot of people have and can draw on when they're speaking about political issues. So I think this was a great episode to kind of get into the lay of the land going into November. Without further ado, here is my episode with Conor Lamb. Conor, welcome to the show. It is great to have you on.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. So you have done it all. You have been a Marine officer, a federal prosecutor, a congressman, and a Senate candidate. Now, looking at American politics today, which of those experiences most shapes how you are viewing this political moment that we're in?
Of those, I think being a Marine officer is foundational to everything that's happened to me since, because it's just a very unique and demanding experience that I think transforms your mindset a little bit in terms of just the kind of the sacrifice and the challenge that you go through as part of becoming a Marine, and then understanding the legacy. And there's a really big emphasis on integrity and core values like honesty and courage and things. And when I was later in politics, I would think all the time about this is the government. And the Marine Corps was the government, but here in politics, everybody lies to each other and cares about money and forgets who the people were that sent them there. But in the Marines, people, at least in my experience, really tried to live up to the values that the organization was about. And so I tried to never let go of that. And then I was always thinking, how can we, try to promote that in other areas of life? Although the one part of my career you didn't mention, but it is a big part of how I see things now too, is I'm a plaintiff's side trial lawyer, and I represent these people who, many of them don't really have anyone else to speak for them. Something terrible has happened to them, like a death or a horrible accident or whatever. And, I think people feel very ignored and counted out by the kind of abuses of power that Trump is constantly both doing and getting away with. And so, at our little group of trial lawyers, Pennsylvania Association for Justice is what we call ourselves. We're always trying to provide at least some check in the balance of power between what Trump and those people are doing, or big corporations or big healthcare. And that has been really important to me, is being on the side of the underdog since I left politics, and it has exposed me to a lot.
I will say that after interviewing a bunch of candidates coming into the midterms, my favorite people to interview are always veterans. I love a mission-driven, type of person that is shaped by, and especially those values always brings out the best in people. And the way they always turn back to it and say, this was my experience. It taught me to be, a good group leader and how to lead in a fight. And those people always just blow my mind every time they open their mouths.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. And I remember when we did basic training there, they literally had it posted on the wall, this big sign. They had two of them. One was "You joined us," and the other one was "It's not about you." And that was the constant message that it's about what's good for the group, what's important to the mission. And boy, is that hard for people in politics to embrace or even understand. And I always felt like it was the fellow veterans, even people on the other side of the aisle, that sometimes you could connect with better, because there was just that little acknowledgement that hey, if we're here as a group, it's supposed to be about the team. It's not really supposed to be about each of us. And people have that experience outside the military too, but it really is drilled into you in the military.
Right. Right, absolutely. So I did check out your Substack. You've got some great pieces going on there, short, quick reads for anyone that wants to take a look at them. But a lot of your recent writing has focused on democracy, accountability, and institutions. What made you decide to launch your Substack, and what conversations did you feel were not happening elsewhere that you wanted to bring to the forefront?
Yeah, a couple of things. For me, I'm a little different than most people in the sense that for me, Substack, I was not starting from zero and trying to grow an audience. I was taking the audience of people that I communicated with as a candidate through my email list and who were used to opening emails from me, usually asking for money, but on substantive topics too. And I wanted to keep that conversation going. I just kind of needed a mechanism to keep talking to them, even though I'm not asking for anything. I wanted to keep my connection. And like I see those people in my real life when I'm around Pittsburgh and stuff, people will stop me and say, "Hey, I got your email the other day." And so the subject matter is just really what's on my mind, what I'm most concerned about. I do some teaching on the side at Duquesne Law School as well, and it's a lot about democracy and our institutions because, obviously people respect these institutions less and less, and that it causes a lot of, bad downstream effects in our society. It makes it very hard to fix problems and get things done if no one trusts the people that are supposed to be doing that. And I do think that Trump is in the midst of a concerted effort to turn this into something other than the constitutional democratic republic we've inherited. And, the foundation of that country that we have inherited, though it is imperfect, is the idea that all of us are created equal. That is kind of what sits at the center of it, and everything else grows out from that. And the approach, of Stephen Miller to immigration and Hegseth thinking he can just sort of execute people at sea and all these different examples, even things like just ripping healthcare away from people with no reason, all demonstrate an attitude that, no, in this society, it's going to be kind of the strong do what they want and everybody else, suffers what they must, or whatever the saying is. And that's really not a democracy in any recognizable form. And I don't want us to not realize that's taking place. It's tempting to think, oh, Trump is just doing typical Republican politics now. No, he's not. Like, he's really trying to change the fabric of what this country is. And I think in order for people to know how to successfully push back against it, they have to appreciate the significance of what's going on.
Right. Well, and that's what I think is so frustrating about Trump right now, is that it's become so normalized, and that people that aren't like you and I and aren't like ingrained in everything and absorbing news like it's water, don't fully appreciate how significant some of the things he's doing actually are. So any light that anybody can shed on those things is vitally important.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right about that. And I think it's purposeful by him, not unlike what's been documented in Putin's Russia. They behave in such a way that makes a lot of normal people want to tune out. So it's not like all these normal people out there are like loving what Trump's doing. It's more like it's just kind of easy to turn off and focus on other things. And that in and of itself is good for him. It's enabling for him. And so you have to try to find ways to, raise awareness. But one of the biggest challenges is people are kind of sick of it. And there's a lot they'd rather, laugh or listen to good music or do all the awesome things that our society offers. And so that's an ongoing issue for people like me and you. Yeah.
Right, right. So one of your recent pieces argues that the accountability is coming if Democrats are able to take back the House. I found that interesting because I wrote a piece on Substack about how we should kind of temper our expectations when we're looking at accountability. Looking at American history, in my opinion, there aren't many examples of political elites facing widespread consequences after periods of Democratic backsliding. Why do you think you are more optimistic than I am?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question, and I don't even know if I can qualify as optimistic. I think that I'm hopeful, which is slightly different, but I think that we've reached a point where if we don't take action in some way on accountability, it will cause a major fracturing in our society as far as distrust, and it also will basically just be a blank check for any future Trump-like administration to do even worse things than this one is doing. So we've reached such a low point. I guess what I'm trying to say is I can't see any other way than to try to impose accountability. And, as a civil justice lawyer now, I look at that in a very broad form. So I don't think what I was saying in the piece is probably not everything will be, a Jack Smith-led DOJ prosecution. You might see the members of the Pennsylvania Association for Justice taking up cases on behalf of people who have been harmed by the Trump administration's actions. Some of them already are, of course, but if we can find a way to encourage more of that and sort of decentralize the process of justice and accountability, A, it's harder to defeat that then, but B, it may also be a little bit more palatable to the public that way. I think some of what these, whether it's the Mueller report or Jack Smith, when you have a single focus like that, it might be easier for the other side to kind of demonize that person than if a lot of people are working on it in various different forums.
I think we ended up closer together on that than I thought we would, because I had kind of argued that, like, people want to see the people at the top in handcuffs at the very least. They want to see Stephen Miller, walked out of the White House with handcuffs on, Donald Trump, Tulsi Gabbard, all those people. But, like, we shouldn't expect the people at the top, was my point, to face justice the way we want them to. It's more likely, in my opinion, that the people, the middlemen and the sycophants, are going to be more likely to face justice.
That's interesting. Yeah. I mean, I guess that's where I just don't know what the evidence looks like at this point.
Right.
My belief is probably that Stephen Miller has personally directed a lot of things that people below him would say, I was forced to do this by him. And so, he may be an example of someone where accountability would flow to him, but it's just, it's a really tricky area. And I have to be honest about that, where we also don't want to become a country that criminalizes politics. And so it's really the evidence itself that will distinguish things that were unlawful acts from things that were kind of heinous political acts. And that's why you are going to need people who are able to look at this through something of a non-political lens. And it's going to be very easy for a future Democratic administration to want to turn a blind eye to all this, because it's going to be very complicated and take time. But I think it has to be done for our culture. We can't have zero accountability for, even just something like Alex Preddy and Renee Good, like, were murdered openly in front of everyone on camera. We all saw it. And it's how much later now, and there's sort of obviously no prosecution taking place of the people that did that. You just can't have that.
Right. Well, I really like that you made the distinction between heinous political acts versus something that is concretely illegal. Like, I feel like I'm going to take that now when I analyze literally anything that this administration does, because it's a blurred line, I feel like, at this point, where it's not that easy to tell I don't have a law degree, but it's not that easy to tell for the everyday person what is something that was done illegally versus what is something that was just politically motivated and awful to most people.
That's right. Yeah. And I think, one of the ways we look at things in the type of law that I practice, which is, a lot of it has to do with sort of physical harms that happen to people, medical malpractice, serious accidents. You look at who is the victim and how bad is it, what happened to them, because ultimately, if you're in front of a jury, that is what's going to sway them more than you just telling them how bad the conduct was itself. They want to know the impact. And so for all the terrible things happening in the Trump administration, I think one of the things that civil lawyers, like people in my field, can bring to it is, that focus on who the victims are and who was impacted, the actual people who have been detained by ICE for months on end and kept from their families, and people who I'm sure were wrongly deported, and people who were wrongly arrested in various ways. And obviously Alex Preddy and Renee Good and examples like that, those are sort of tailor-made for Department of Justice investigations, Attorney General investigations. But you look at an issue like corruption, quid pro quos, bribes, whatever Trump's doing with crypto and money from the Middle East and all that kind of thing, that still should be investigated and prosecuted. But sometimes it's a harder sell to the public, because people will look at that and go, well, what's the harm? I mean, what's the harm from that? There's a big harm if it turns out that he pursued certain public policies against people's interests in order to get that money, then there's a big harm. So that harm principle, right. It's important to us as civil plaintiffs lawyers. I think it could be important to the next administration as well.
Right. So you've also written about the need for moral clarity in your case when thinking about things like voting rights and democratic institutions. In general, though, there is a larger conversation about moral clarity as it appears in politics. What do you think that looks like in practice, and how should Democrats be communicating those issues without sounding disconnected from voters' everyday concerns?
Yeah, it's hard, bringing bringing morality into it, I think, runs a lot of risks. And I think we're a society that agrees less and less kind of on what our morality even says. But like I was saying earlier, when in my teaching, I keep coming back to this example of the way with my students, we look at the Lincoln Douglas debates. And so this is before the Civil War, before Lincoln's even president. And he and Douglas are really debating the issue of slavery in the context of a Senate campaign, which Lincoln loses and Douglas wins. But the argument that Lincoln is making is that everything in America is about what was said in the Declaration of Independence of us all being created equal. And you have to make that the foundational idea for all of our public policy. And that obviously slavery goes against that. And, I think that just trying to harp on that one idea that we all have to have some equal standing in the society for it to make sense is a form of morality that we can talk about and agree on. It does not mean, like, I'm not someone that says, and that means we have to have a universal basic income for every American or some sort of government handout that goes with that. But it does mean that, like, government agents can't just take you away with no due process and send you to a gulag in El Salvador. And, it should also mean that if you have something like insurance that you've relied on for a long time and that has helped keeping you healthy and alive, like, it doesn't just get ripped away with very little thought given to the consequences of that. And there's many different examples, but I think that just that basic principle of fairness and equality, not so much equality of result, but equality to be heard, to be thought about, to be cared about. I don't think that's a purely partisan thing. And it obviously relates to the issues in people's everyday lives that a lot of people feel very frustrated because they think, we've been talking about high prices for so long and people are ignoring us. They're not hearing the pain that we're feeling. And that's because this administration doesn't care about you if you're going through that. Honestly, I mean, they care what Peter Thiel and Elon Musk think, and they govern accordingly. So I think that's a way for us to try to bring some of that language.
Right. Well, and it can cross the line into feeling very, like, lecturing at people. Like,
Yeah.
I am the moral hierarch on this one, and, like, you just aren't moral enough to understand what I'm saying. So it's a tough one.
Yeah, I agree totally. I think, though, that people can feel in their gut that Donald Trump is an immoral person who does not have their interests at heart. And so if at the very least, we're raising the issue of morality as something more than a basic political critique and just saying, this person is infecting us like a cancer. Like, we have to stop it in order to have a better country. I think that's a fair point to make. But it quickly has to be followed with, like, well, what are you going to do? Because if there's one thing I learned, especially in my first election, which was in very, very red territory, a lot of times people don't want to talk about Trump. They really don't. And they don't like it when you raise the issue, and they would prefer to hear about.
You're speaking my language. I've been reaming against candidates that have all over their website, I'm going to stop Trump. I'm going to stop the Trump agenda. And then I have to scroll 6 times to find what their action plan is. It bothers me to no end, but you are absolutely correct.
Well, I don't know which candidates these are, but there's probably something to do with gerrymandering in that. I mean, people have to remember that there's a very, very small number of so-called swing or competitive districts. And in a lot of districts in America, it's perfectly adequate for a Democrat to do what you just said and get elected. And on the Republican side, it's perfectly adequate for them to get Trump's endorsement and then just ride that the whole way. And there's very little engagement or debate beyond that. And it's just in these small number of districts, like the one I used to represent, where you actually have to go out and try to meet people where they are.
Right, absolutely. So we have seen repeated challenges to things like voting rights, election administration, and public trust in elections over the past decade at this point. What concerns you the most right now of all of the things that Trump is kind of undermining? What worries you?
I think what worries me the most is sort of post-election shenanigans around counting/certifying ballots. In a state like Pennsylvania, that's a very decentralized process. So it's happening in all 67 of our counties separately. And, many of those 67 counties are controlled by a pretty strong pro-Trump majority of local officials. And I think that if they are able to mess around and inject doubt into what's happening, that could provoke a fair amount of violence and unrest in ways that we may or may not be able to predict. But I just think the country is a little bit on a knife's edge of tension, and a lot of people are really going to want to turn the page from Trump in the next couple of elections. And so, to me, the cure for that is the courts, and in particular, the ability of trial lawyers and their clients and to get into court, and judges to be willing to hear cases and challenges to what's going on very quickly and to be decisive. Because I think if these issues are being heard and dealt with in the first week, I think that's a lot less potential for bad things down the road. But if it's like, if you remember what 2020 was like, there was a long drawn out period from when Biden and Harris are declared the winners through the certification date in early December, and you've got slates of false electors, and the whole thing, continues going until it reaches this climax on January 6th, 2 months later. And I think that one of the things to learn from that is we need courts to really act quickly and decisively. And, one of the things we do at Pennsylvania Association for Justice is across issues, really just fight for the ability of litigants to get into courts and have trials, because trials where the evidence can come out in an open courtroom and the media can report on it and witnesses actually have to swear to their story, that's where a lot of this stuff really falls apart. That's where Rudy Giuliani's story falls apart and all the stuff about fraud and whatever. And you just need that to happen quickly and effectively.
So do you think that Democrats have done an effective job at making things like voting rights and election integrity a kitchen table issue, or do you think the conversation has maybe become too abstract for the average voter?
Well, I think those issues are going to remain abstract for anyone that has never felt their right to vote really be challenged. And so there's not a lot we can do about that. It's a good thing that most people are not running into obstacles with their right to be able to vote. I have definitely perceived that since the Supreme Court's decision on voting rights this year, I think the African-American community is feeling much, much more strongly about this issue. And I would expect in the South in particular that it is a real kitchen table issue for people again. And I think older people are talking to younger people about what the past was like and how they had to fight for these rights. I've definitely picked up on that. So I think that's the most we can expect, and it's sad that it has come to this, but you just have to keep going back to people and saying, why do you think that they're trying to limit people's rights to vote? I mean, if they were so confident in their record governing this country, do you really think they would have to try to keep people from getting to the courthouse? I don't think so.
Right. Absolutely. So let's talk about the Democratic Party as a whole. There's an ongoing debate as primaries continue to happen about whether the Democratic Party is going to move forward through populism, institutionalism, being moderate, or something else entirely. Where do you think the party is headed?
It's hard to answer that, and I'm not trying to avoid it, but we are a very big party that is extremely diverse, racially, ideologically, geographically. We're different from the Republicans in ways that people kind of forget about, but that diversity is a really important part of it. And, we've kind of delayed this conversation about the direction that we want to take for quite a while. And I think the presidential primary process leading up to 2028 is our chance to have that conversation. And it's so big that I don't know that anyone can predict exactly where it's going to go. I think we're going to learn a lot from the 2026 results. You've got some pretty populist Democrats out there who've either already been nominated or pursuing the nomination for big competitive races, and we're going to see how they do. I think those results are going to inform other Democrats quite a lot in terms of what works and what doesn't. And I think that we've got some governors who have records in their states. They're going to be able to talk about that and try to relate it to an overall philosophy. So it's hard to predict how it's all going to turn out. But I'll be honest, I was someone that in 2020 and 2024 was a little bit afraid of what the primary process would do. I thought it would rock the boat and kind of help Trump. But now it's clear we have to have this kind of family discussion and debate and get through it and see where it leads us.
Right. Well, I've always felt like because when Biden dropped out, Kamala took his place, we didn't have the primary process to have the big family Thanksgiving where we're yelling at each other and throwing mashed potatoes across the table and like really hammer out the vision that we wanted.
Right.
And now we're 4 years delayed on that. And I think it's making, I don't think anything you said was really a cop-out answer, because the answer is that we're still figuring it out.
Yeah, it's really a bigger question than any one of us can answer. And I think it would be kind of self-serving to just say like, oh, I think the Democrats should choose the moderates or, whatever. I think we have to have respect for the voters in our party who are making choices around the country in slightly different ways. And, we also really haven't had this discussion without the specter of Trump yet. And this is, 2028 is going to be the first time we're going to get to say, hey, this is what we think the future looks like, and Trump's not going to be part of it. So we can't just rely on who can bash Trump the best anymore. And I really think everyone across the whole spectrum owes voters a serious answer on the economy and the fact that it has become so K-shaped, so slanted in the direction of, the top 1% to 5% or whatever it is, where most of the growth and spending is taking place. And, we have to have a serious conversation with people about how we're going to lead the country out of it, especially as it seems like AI is going to be a force that makes that worse instead of better in terms of the concentration of wealth and power. And it kind of just isn't enough to say like, break up the companies, Medicare for all or whatever. Like, we have to really take on like, how is the economy going to function day to day? How can we help you get a job so money's in your hands and you're not sitting around, waiting for someone to give you something? But, we're not just letting these companies do whatever they want either. And that's going to take some time.
Right. I also like the first thing you said about like trusting the voters in each district, because one of my kind of big pain points is every time a Democrat wins a race, there's always some sort of conversation about like, oh, that's a bad Democrat. Like I don't like that brand of Democrat. And my
I've
whole
been the
kind
subject
of like
of many of those conversations.
my whole kind of thought process on that is the right Democrat for the time and the place that they are running in. If you are not in that place, you have literally no understanding of what those voters are thinking and feeling and going through at that moment. So those feel like fruitless conversations, quite frankly. Like, I think about it a lot in like the case of Graham Plattner and Mamdani and the candidates that he backed. Like, those are the right candidates for the time and the place that they ran. That doesn't mean that they are the right candidate to run for president.
Yeah, and it doesn't mean that, they represent sort of the center of the Democratic Party. It means that the voters in their district, like you said, felt they were best. And I just think we need to step back and ask ourselves, do we want to be a party that enforces some kind of homogeneity in the way that we think or the way that we represent our constituents or whatever? I would be like very proud to be a party that's as different from the Republicans as possible. And one of those main differences being that we tolerate a big range of views, and it might be a little bit uncomfortable, and some of those views might lead to, intra-party conflict from time to time. But like, let's just all stay on the same team and stay committed to working it out if we can. That's something the Republicans can't really do. Like, any time that someone crosses Trump, everything just falls apart. They don't have that ability to really debate things within their side and kind of get through conflicts. And so they accomplish very little for all the power that Trump has accumulated. He accomplishes very little. And I don't want that to be us. I want us to be someone that's able to work through these things so that we can get to the other side of an actual achievement.
Right. And that's something that I've learned a lot doing this. Like, I interviewed Kate Conley, who just won in New York 17, and the woman who won in Nebraska won, who's Denise Powell, who are in two of the closest races, much like yourself in 2018, two of the closest districts that will happen this year. And the questions that I have for them are much different than the questions that I have for a candidate running in like a deep blue district, because the voters there are so different. In a swing district, like, it is more about moderation and how can you mold a policy to be, likable on both sides of the aisle. Whereas in deep red or blue districts, you're swinging for the fences. Like, you're saying crazy stuff at some points, and that's fine because that is what the voters want to hear.
Yeah, I think the only sort of danger is that often what happens is because the people in the safe districts always win and get reelected. In these institutions that are about seniority, they accumulate power over time and they become committee chairs and leaders of the caucus and that kind of thing. And the people like I was, the people like Kate Conley is going to be, they're often only there for a few terms before they either lose or maybe they go for something else. But it's this kind of perverse result where the people who kind of represent the middle of the country the best, or the swing areas, they end up on the fringes of their own caucus and with sort of least power in Washington on a day-to-day basis. And that's something I think we need to figure out how to fix, because it perverts the policymaking a little bit, where, you end up with these members in 90-10 districts who are dictating the big time policy choices, but then the people in the swing districts are paying for the electoral consequences of that. And it's probably not the way it should be if you were designing it from scratch. So that's something we should try to improve on.
Right. So in 2018, you won one of the most closely watched House races in the country in a district that, as you mentioned earlier, was not considered easy territory for Democrats. What did that race teach you about persuading swing voters? And do you think Democrats are applying those lessons today?
I think with that race taught me several things, and let me try to boil it down. One was just this sense that goes beyond policy, where I think voters want the feeling that someone is really trying to listen to them and learn from them, and is not just trying to come in with a kind of a pre-cooked agenda that they're going to sell you or impose on you. And because I was 33 years old and I had been in, the Department of Justice and the military, so I really had been in non-political stuff, I was coming in honestly a pretty blank slate as far as a lot of the issues. And so it was natural to me to go around and just ask people about their lives and what they had done in their careers and how it informed how they looked at policy. And I think that just really helped me to not necessarily have so much of a defined agenda up front, and to take the representing part seriously. Like, I'm going there to represent you, which means I'm going to listen to you and try to do things that are good for the district. Often that's portrayed kind of in social media as like a cop out or ducking the strong stands you should be taking as a politician. But I'm just telling you, I don't know that a lot of voters in districts like that are expecting every person that runs to have an answer on every possible thing and to constantly be screaming at the top of their lungs about it. So there's a lot to the act of listening, for sure. People do want to see that you're willing to stand up to your own party in some way. It's just a fact. They think that the two-party system is kind of messed up, and they have a lot of frustration with it. And that's borne out in registration numbers in Pennsylvania, like many other states. Independent is by far the fastest growing thing that people are registering as. And so, for me, that took the form of this issue of, will you vote for Nancy Pelosi for speaker? Because, this is 2017, 18. It's kind of hard to remember now because she had such an epic run starting in 2019 once we went into the majority and she's opposing Trump and people really were loving her. But in 17, 18, there were a lot of doubts about her leadership and whether she'd been around too long. And in my district, it was just kind of a no-brainer. She didn't connect with people. She was coastal, and they wanted to see something different. So I said, you know what, if I go there, I'm young, I'm going to vote for, I am new leadership, I'm going to vote for new leadership. Nothing personal to her, but I think we need new leaders across the board in all parties. So that was a commitment I made. And when I finally got sworn into the full term, the next Congress, I voted against her, and people really appreciated that. I was surprised because I thought, back to my Marine Corps thing from before, I said I was going to do it. Obviously, I'm going to do it. But once I actually voted for someone else and I came back to my district, people were coming up to me and saying, I can't believe you actually went through with that. I thought they would change your mind. I thought there was no way. And I was just like, no, I think you have to do what you say you're going to do. So, that everyone has to find their own way to something like that. And it can't be gratuitous. I think someone like John Fetterman, for example, antagonizes the Democrats constantly in a way that is not productive or even honest. That was honest for me. I did think we should get new leaders. And so I said it, whatever. But then we worked together perfectly fine while I was there, and, it all worked out in the end.
So speaking of John Fetterman, you ran against him in the 2022 Senate primary. Looking back, not that you have to shit all over yourself, but what do you think Democrats saw in him at the time that made him such a compelling candidate?
I think it's similar to this year where you read about how, people are choosing a Plattner or someone else because they represent this challenge not only to Trump, but to establishment Democrats who people really feel have let them down kind of in the basic act of resisting Trump and I think they blame establishment Democrats for losing to Trump in 2024 and all these kind of things. And it seemed that way in 2021, 22, even though we're coming off Biden's victory. At that point, Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema had thwarted a lot of our agenda and stopped us from delivering a lot of the things that Biden had campaigned on. And even though I was in the House voting for all of Biden's stuff and not, really not on the same side of Manchin and Sinema on those issues, I had relationships with both of them. I'd worked with both of them, and people kind of associated with me with them. So I sort of, even though I was younger, I fell into this establishment category, and Fetterman is sort of visually, obviously very anti-establishment. And he'd been around the state a lot, doing a lot of social media, and people just really knew him better than they knew me. And so it was kind of easy for them to feel like he's the bigger fighter. He represented the spirit of what they needed. And it was something I figured out once I got on the campaign trail. It was almost like, I just kind of couldn't make up that deficit. And there, it probably was just not the right race for me looking back, but it's hard to know that on the front end. And I think you have to make these decisions about what you feel strongly about, not so much about the consequences, because it's impossible to game out. And I'd been in the House watching all of our work get thwarted in the Senate. I didn't think Fetterman could ever win a general election. I turned out to be wrong about that too. But I just thought, you know what, I got to step up and run for this because I don't want to see the Democrats give the seat away. And we really need it in order to get some of this stuff passed. So I felt strongly. And I even though I didn't run a great race, I've always been proud at least that I stepped up and did that when I didn't have to. So.
Right. So, as you mentioned, since taking office, Fetterman has antagonized Democrats, taken positions that have surprised some of the voters and activists who originally supported him. What do you make of the gap between the candidate that many people thought they were electing and the senator that he has now become?
And it's surprising even to me. My critique of him was that he was an empty suit, that it was all flash and no substance. You've got someone who'd been a mayor for several terms and then lieutenant governor. He'd been in all these positions and no one could name anything substantial he'd ever accomplished. Like he just walked around and did Twitter and talked. Like he just wasn't an effective public servant. And I think that's because he doesn't really have like deeply held core beliefs about what he should be accomplishing. It's just whatever the moment is of the day and how can I get publicity around it. And a person like that, sort of blows in the wind. And I think what happened was he got down there and he saw Bob Casey lose in 24 and, Biden drop out and then Harris lose. And he sensed that the wind was blowing in this pro-Trump direction and he likes to get attention. So sort of being the Trump-friendly Democrat gave him that. And over time, he just did more and more and more of it, which I guess is a publicity strategy, but it just speaks to this vacuum in his core. Like, what are you there for? Like, who are you representing? The only thing you ever hear about from him is Israel. That's the only thing he speaks about with any conviction. And, it's fine to like Israel and want to support their interests or whatever, but you were elected by Pennsylvania. Like that should be number one. And then, many issues affecting Pennsylvanians should be 2, 3, 4, and 5, but you just don't hear about that from him at all. And I think that's because I just think he doesn't really care. But, I guess we'll find out if he decides to run for re-election.
That's very interesting because now that primaries have gone on, I live in Illinois 9, which I don't know if you heard, but faced a long, ugly, brutal primary back in March. But it
Is
faced
that the
a
old
lot of
Chiknowski district?
Correct.
Okay.
That's her. But there was a lot of online chatter about like people thinking like, speaking for my lived experience in the district I live in. And what you've said just kind of struck me because I'm thinking back to what I remember in his 2022 primary and later general election run. And like those thoughts never once crossed my mind because I don't live in Pennsylvania. Like I didn't get to experience that the way that you did and so many other Pennsylvanians did. But the more you're talking, the more I'm like, yeah, that tracks. Like he was lieutenant governor, but he was a name that I had literally never heard before in my life until he ran. And I remember the conversation around like him not having much to stand on, but like simultaneously there was the conversation of like, well, he's the best shot. Like we need to, like everybody needs to vote for him. Like this is like the only shot that we've got. Like I do remember that. So it's very interesting because I think it's speaking to my, like you can't know a district that you don't live in or a state that you don't live in.
Yeah. Well, and he, the other thing he did was he built this very impressive movement of grassroots donors. And they were small donors and they were really dedicated to him. And he was constantly pumping out content for them. And it made it seem like it was this very grassroots thing that anybody could appreciate who wants to get money out of politics and have, sort of more normal representation. And I think those people feel defrauded the most now because a lot of them were from out of state and they were pouring money into this thing, hoping it was going to cause a major change, and it's kind of blown up on them. So that's interesting too, is, we tend to think of like small dollar fundraising as this really good thing that should promote more kind of politicians that are.
Right. I will say I was living in Washington, D.C. at the time, And I was walking in my neighborhood when it was closer to the general election. So it must have been like September, October. I was walking in my neighborhood and somebody had a Fetterman sign in their front yard. And I remember
Yeah.
being like, that's weird. He's not running here. It was very odd.
Well, and then,
I
he
think
had the
that's
stroke at the end of the primary campaign, beginning of the general. So it gave him this additional underdog status where people were really looking at him and going, wow, this guy's fighting to overcome this horrible thing that happened to him. And there was a lot of goodwill for him because of that. And I think that makes it even, more hurtful to a lot of people too,
right.
especially when you meet people that were volunteering here to knock on doors, because there was the sense, for several months that year, he like literally could not speak for himself. And so people were out there doing it for him. And that's the part of it I've never been able to square, is how it's one thing to have individual, issues where you kind of buck the party and whatever. I think that's good and it's healthy. But he has become so hostile to the people that actually like dragged him over the line that I don't understand why that is. Like, I don't think they
Yeah.
ever did anything except support him. So.
Yeah. Well, I think you were right earlier when you said we just have to wait and see if he runs again. It's those, what is it? When is he up? 28? Those 2
Right.
years can't
28.
come soon enough, in my humble opinion. I said it, not you. One last question for you. If Democrats regain control of the House, fingers crossed the Senate too, what do you think success looks like in the first year? Not just politically, but institutionally.
Not just politically, but institutionally. Well, the institutional piece that I would love to see are younger, newer members chairing committees. It's a very delicate issue in the Democratic side because seniority has meant a lot to the Black Caucus in particular. And we have members who, when they came, they knew that seniority was the only way to go up because there was still racism throughout the institution and they would be blocked any other way. And so that has been an important issue for Democrats, is sort of preserving that seniority system so that people would get a fair chance at power. But I think a lot of us believe the world has changed in important ways. And, we chose Hakeem Jeffries as our leader completely not based on the seniority system, based on his merits and how much he united the caucus and everybody liked him. So to me, that was a sign that we can invest in some of our younger leaders in a way that's fair and equitable too. And I think that would be important for us to do. Politically, it's tough because Trump sucks up most of the oxygen in the room. Everything will be seen through an anti-Trump lens. We have very little ability to offer affirmative new ideas, but we can offer a few economically, of course. And then the other thing we can do is, I wrote about this in the Substack you mentioned, is lay the groundwork for some of these investigations that have to take place, again, that relate to core issues of people's constitutional rights and corruption, by which I mean, the investigative committees can be sending subpoenas to banks, to social media companies, to whoever, to start to gather some of the evidence out there about what these people are up to and why they've made the decisions that they've made, and gathering that evidence in advance of a new Justice Department or state attorneys general getting it, or private litigants, who knows. That's an important task. The January 6th committee did that, and a lot of that groundwork, ended up supporting some of the actual accountability measures that followed. So.
Perfect. I do have one other question. When you voted against Nancy Pelosi, who did you vote for?
It would happen twice. The first time I voted for Joe Kennedy, and
Okay.
I think there was a headline in the Boston Globe after that said like Joe Kennedy loses speaker election, because technically he got a vote while she got 220. And then the next time I sort of saw which way I thought things were going, and I voted for Hakeem Jeffries. So I was always proud to say I think I was his first vote ever for speaker, even though I wasn't there when he was elected minority leader. I got it in one term early. So.
That's actually pretty cool. You should be wearing that with a badge of honor.
Yeah, it hasn't really caught fire yet, but I'm reminding him and everyone I know of that all the time. So.
Perfect. Love it. Well, that is all I have for you. Is there anything you feel like I might have missed?
No, I appreciate you having me on. I know I mentioned a couple of times my current job. I think one thing I've really come to appreciate is how many people out there are trying to take these problems into their own hands and not necessarily wait for or rely on the federal government anymore. I was just meeting with one of our county elected officials here, and she was taking me through all the budgetary things they're doing to try to make up for the losses on, Medicaid and housing assistance and these different things. And I see that in civil litigation where I think, we have a lot of lawyers in Pennsylvania Association for Justice who have stepped up and represented these immigrant families and other people, sometimes free of charge, because we just have to preserve the sense that we're not going to let these atrocities take place in our country.
Right.
And it's hard to see when you're in office in Washington. And now that I'm kind of back on the ground, it's been very encouraging for me to see. So
we love a message of hope. Well, thank you so much for coming on. I will have your Substack linked in the show notes so everybody can go subscribe to that, see your videos, see your posts. Good writing, as I said. But yeah, thank you so much for coming on. I appreciate it.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you guys so much for tuning into this episode of Current Affairs Unfiltered. I hope you enjoyed hearing from Conor. Like I said at the top, I think he has just such a wide array of knowledge and experience, and I think something like that is invaluable today when so many of our leaders do not have experience. And it's always great to hear from somebody that is able to draw on that. But if you would like to subscribe to Conor's Substack, I will have that linked in the show notes. He makes some great pieces, has some great videos, so I do highly suggest you subscribe to him on there. But yeah, if you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to follow, leave a review, or share it with someone who could use this information. To support this podcast, you can also subscribe to my Substack, She Knows the Score, which is linked in the show notes. And as always, if you have questions, topic suggestions, or just want to say hi, you can find me on social media at Current Affairs Unfiltered Pod on Instagram, or send me an email at currentaffairs.unfilteredpod@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you. Keep asking questions, stay engaged, and remember to volunteer for your local candidate running in a swing district. I will see you guys next week.